My name is Eleonora Pemberton, and I am 72 years old. I want you to remember that number. 72. Not because it matters how old I am, but because of what people see when they look at a woman my age standing alone on a sidewalk with luggage. They see a problem. They do not see a person. I learned this on a Tuesday morning in November of 2024 when I walked out of the apartment building at 1847 Maple Street in Asheville, North Carolina, for the last time. The building where I had lived for 31 years. The building where my husband Harlan and I raised our two sons. The building where I had washed those 8th floor windows on the last Friday of every month for 3 decades. I walked out with one blue suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes, and the strangest feeling that I was leaving behind a woman I had been pretending to be for a very long time. The doorman was not there that morning. He had called in sick, so I carried the boxes down myself, one at a time, in the elevator that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. I set them on the sidewalk. I went back up for the suitcase. I came back down. I set it next to the boxes, and then I stopped. I placed both hands flat on top of that suitcase. I looked up at the 8th floor window, and I did something I cannot fully explain even now. I stood still, just stood there. For how long, I do not know. Maybe a full minute, maybe 3. Long enough that the woman across the street, Mrs. Halverson, from 1845, pulled back her curtain and stared at me. Long enough that a man walking a small white dog crossed to the other side of the street to avoid me. They thought I was confused. They thought I was one of those old women who wanders off, who forgets where she lives, who needs someone to come find her. But I was not confused. I was saying goodbye. Not to the building, not really. The building was just brick and glass. I was saying goodbye to the woman who had lived inside it, the wife, the mother, the person who had made coffee at 5:40 every morning for 49 years, the person who had folded Harlan's shirts a certain way because she knew he liked the collar pressed flat, the person who had hung her watercolor of Lincolnton above the sofa and watered the ferns on the balcony and believed, somewhere underneath everything, that a life lived quietly was a life lived correctly. That woman was about to be left on this sidewalk. And another woman, one I had not yet met, was about to step into a taxi and drive away. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call. My husband was dead. My 2 sons were the reason I was standing there with my luggage. So I just stood there and I waited. Let me tell you how this happened. Because if you are watching this, if you are listening to my story, you might think this kind of thing only happens in books. It does not. It happens on Tuesday mornings in November. It happens to women who have done everything right. It happens. My name is Eleonora, but Harlan called me Nora. He started calling me that on our second date in the summer of 1974, when I was 22 years old and working behind the counter at Hargrove's Pharmacy on Trade Street in Lincolnton, North Carolina. Harlan came in looking for a antifungal cream. He had been doing field work in the Blue Ridge for his forestry program at NC State, and he had picked up some kind of rash on his ankle. He was 25, tall and thin, hands that belonged outdoors. He talked about trees the way other men talked about cars. I remember thinking, this one is different. I went to the back to find his cream, and when I came back, he was looking out the window at a white oak across the street. He said, to no one in particular, that an oak that size had to be 80 years old. I said, I know. I grew up next to that tree. He looked at me, really looked. He came back the next week with a fake question about vitamins. The week after, he came back again. This time he asked me to coffee. My mother told me not to go. My grandmother told me to run. I went. We were married in March of 1975. I was 23. He was 27. The ceremony was small. 40 guests in the First Baptist Church of Lincolnton. My mother sewed my dress. The photographs came out slightly overexposed because the church had too many windows on the west side. I kept those photographs in a burgundy album for 49 years. That album was in one of the cardboard boxes on the sidewalk. Roderick was born in 1977, our oldest, 2 years after the wedding. He came into the world arguing, and he never really stopped. By the time he was 10, he was negotiating his own punishments with a skill that left me privately impressed and publicly exhausted. He grew up to study law, which surprised exactly no one. Cyrus came 3 years later in 1980, our youngest. He was quieter, easier in daily life. But there was something underneath the quiet that took me decades to name, and when I finally named it, it broke my heart a little. Indifference, not cruelty. Cyrus was never cruel, but he had a genuine capacity to not care deeply about anything that did not directly affect his own life. He became a financial consultant. He moved to Charlotte. He came home for holidays and called once a month and did the math on his obligations the way an accountant does. I love them both. I love them both still, but I know who they are. A mother always knows. Harlan was a forester. He worked for the United States Forest Service for 32 years, and after he retired, he kept consulting on the side. He traveled a lot, weekends in the mountains, sometimes a full week away. I managed the household alone, and I never complained, because his work had always been this way, and because I had been raised by a mother who believed a wife held the home together so the husband could build the world outside it. I do not regret that. I want to be clear. I built a life I was proud of. But there were things I noticed over the years. His work pants would come home with sawdust on them. Not dirt, sawdust. The kind that comes from a planer or a saw, not from walking through a forest. He would drop rolls of film off at the pharmacy and pick them up in sealed envelopes without showing me. One time, when Roderick was 15, he wandered into Harlan's study and asked about the blueprints on the desk. Harlan closed the folder before our son could see them. He said in a voice that sounded slightly too light, "Work stuff, son. Boring stuff." I noticed everything, but I never asked, because that was the kind of woman I had been trained to be. One night, in July of 2004, I woke up at 3 in the morning and found Harlan sitting on the apartment balcony with a glass of bourbon, looking at nothing. I went out and sat beside him. He did not speak for a long time. And then he said, in a voice that was strange because it was not sad, it was something else, something I could not name. He said, "When I die, don't let them sell the forest." My voice was steady, but my hands were not. I said, "What forest?" He said, "The forest I've been tending," and then he was quiet again. And I did not ask anything else, because something in his voice told me that he had finished an equation in his head and was satisfied with the answer, and that asking would not change it. I never forgot that night. I turned it over in my mind for years, but I never asked again. Harlan died on a Tuesday morning in November of 2024. He was 75 years old. He was alone. He was walking a fire road between Boone and Blowing Rock, doing a survey for a private landowner. He had a massive heart attack. A hiker found him 40 minutes later. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was already over. I was on the balcony watering the ferns when the phone rang. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, but I cannot. There is no language for it. You hear the voice on the other end. You hear the words. And then there is a kind of sound inside your head that is not a sound. It is the sound of 49 years collapsing. I do not remember setting down the watering can. I do not remember walking to the armchair. I just remember sitting in that armchair in the same clothes, when Roderick arrived at 7 that evening, and the apartment had gone dark around me, and no one had turned on a lamp. The funeral was on Friday at the Morrison Funeral Home on Patton Avenue. More people came than I expected, colleagues from the Forest Service, two younger researchers I did not recognize standing in a corner, speaking quietly the way certain scientific people do, even at a funeral, and a woman, Dr. Adelina Brockwell, 58 years old, professor of ecology at Western Carolina University. She had been Harlan's research partner for 15 years. She brought a bouquet of wildflowers that did not come from any florist I knew. They were the kind of flowers that grow in the high meadows of the Blue Ridge, white trillium, wild bergamot, something purple I could not name. She walked up to me, she took my hand, she said, "Mrs. Pemberton, your husband was a remarkable man, and there are things he was working on that I think you should know about when you are ready." I looked at her. I said, "Thank you." I did not say more, because Murray, my eldest daughter-in-law, was standing 5 feet away, and Murray's eyebrows had already gone up at the sight of this woman. Adelina handed me a small card with her phone number. I put it in my purse. I did not call her, not for a long time. Murray is 45 years old. She is married to Roderick. She is a partner at an interior design firm in Asheville that specializes in what she calls executive residences. She drinks her coffee with the tips of her fingers, as if the cup itself is slightly unsanitary. She has a way of looking at a room that makes the room feel inadequate. She has never liked me. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it as a fact. Tessa is 42, married to Cyrus. She works in luxury real estate in Charlotte. She is not unkind. She is just absent. She checks her phone every 10 minutes, even at funerals, and she texts in the middle of conversations and says, "Sorry, work," when she does it. The grandchildren did not come to the funeral. Roderick's 2 children, 12 and 10. Cyrus's 2 children, 14 and 11. They were home with sitters. I noticed. I did not say anything, but I noticed. 2 weeks after the funeral, Roderick came to the apartment with a manila folder. He sat across from me in the armchair where Harlan used to sit. He put the folder on the coffee table. He used a voice I recognized, the voice he used when he was about to tell me what was going to happen, dressed up as a conversation. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about the paperwork." I said, "All right." Cyrus was there too, standing by the window, looking at his phone. Roderick opened the folder. The will was simple. Harlan had filed it with a notary in 2018, with 2 independent witnesses, fully notarized, legally airtight. The apartment on Maple Street and the financial accounts, totaling approximately $280,000, would go to the 2 boys in equal shares. To me, Harlan had left one thing: 35 acres of forested land in the township of Cardin's Hollow in the Blue Ridge foothills west of Boone, registered at the Watauga County Courthouse. Conservation zone, cannot be subdivided, cannot be developed. Roderick said we had Morale's appraiser look at it. I said, "Oh," he said, "Mom, there's not even a road. There's a trail, but no road. We checked it on Google Earth. It's just woods, dense woods." The appraiser said it has effectively no market value. Dad must have bought it years ago for the timber rights or something, and then the conservation designation made it worthless. Cyrus did not look up from his phone. Roderick said, "We want to make this fair. So we were thinking you could stay with one of us while we figure things out. Or there's a very nice senior residence over in West Asheville. Murray has a friend who works there." I said nothing. Roderick said, "The apartment is going to need to transfer to us per the will, but we'll give you 90 days to make arrangements." 90 days. I said, 90 days. He said, "That's reasonable, Mom." And then Murray walked in from the kitchen, where she had apparently been listening the entire time, and she said, "That's very reasonable." Roderick glanced at her. The eyebrow flicker, that means you did not need to say that. But he said nothing. I rubbed my thumb across my wedding band. That night, after they left, I sat in the armchair for a long time. I looked at the bookshelf, Harlan's books on the left side. Dense technical volumes on forestry and silviculture and Appalachian ecology. Some had pressed leaves between the pages as bookmarks. I looked at the watercolor of Lincolnton above the sofa. I looked at the ferns on the balcony, and I thought about a night in July of 2004 when Harlan had sat out there with his bourbon and said, "When I die, don't let them sell the forest." The forest I've been tending. The forest. I did not understand it then. I did not understand it for 20 years. But that night, sitting alone in my apartment, with the will on the coffee table and my son's voices still echoing faintly in the room, I felt something shift. I did not know what it was. Not yet. But I felt it. The 90 days that followed are days I have never described to anyone in full. There are fragments I have let slip, here and there, to women who have earned the right to hear them. But the whole of it I keep to myself, because some things, when you give them to other people, get smaller. But I will tell you some of it. There was the morning I woke up at 4 a.m. hearing footsteps in the apartment and needed 1 full second to remember it was impossible because Harlan was dead. That 1 second of forgetting, followed by a kind of pain I cannot describe to you accurately, except to say that it was like falling from a height you never climbed. There was the afternoon Murray arrived with an interior designer. She had not called, she had not asked. She came in with a tape measure and a young woman with a tablet, and the two of them walked through my apartment, measuring the walls while I stood in the kitchen making coffee. I heard the numbers spoken aloud. This wall is 14 feet. The balcony runs 10 feet deep. This flooring will need to come out. I stood holding a cup I had not yet filled. I did not cry. I did not say anything. I just stood there, listening to my home being measured for someone else. There was the day Tessa sent me a text, just a link, to a place called Magnolia Gardens Senior Residence in West Asheville. No message, just the link. I did not click it. There was the dinner. Roderick invited me to dinner at his house, the only time during the entire 90 days. Cyrus was not there. Cyrus was in Tokyo on business. It was Roderick and Murray and me in their dining room, with the long table and the lighting Murray had spent 6 months designing. She served some kind of chicken in a sauce I could not identify, and she watched me eat it the way a hostess watches a guest who has just admitted to a food allergy. And then, somewhere between the salad and the main course, she said, in the voice of someone making polite conversation, she said, "Nora, that woman at the funeral, the one with the wildflowers, what was her name again?" I set down my fork. I looked at Murray. I knew what she was doing. I had known it since the moment Adelina had introduced herself and Murray's eyebrows had gone up. She was planting a seed, in case I ever raised any objection to anything, in case I ever pushed back. She wanted Roderick to wonder. She wanted there to be a question in the air about my husband, about me, about whether I had ever really been loved at all. I looked her in the eye. I said, "Her name is Dr. Adelina Brockwell. She was your father-in-law's research partner for 15 years. She is a professor of ecology at Western Carolina University. She has been married to a man named Theodore for 28 years and has 3 grown children, and I know more about Harlan than you ever will, dear. So let's eat." The room went quiet. Roderick looked at his wife. His wife looked at her plate. I finished my chicken. I did not stay for dessert. That was the first time in maybe 40 years that I had spoken to anyone like that. It would not be the last. The night before I left the apartment, I went into the bedroom and opened the top drawer of Harlan's nightstand. The boys had not touched it. It was small, and there was nothing in it that looked valuable to them. Just an old man's drawer, a pair of reading glasses with a broken arm, a box of throat lozenges, a flashlight with dead batteries. But underneath those things was a manila envelope. I had not seen it before. I took it out. I sat on the edge of the bed. I opened it. Inside were three things. The first was a photograph. It was a photograph of me. I am young. I am laughing. I am standing on a beach, and the wind is in my hair, and I am looking at someone outside the frame. I am wearing a yellow sundress I do not remember owning, and I have no memory whatsoever of when this photograph was taken. I stared at it for a long time. The second thing was a slip of paper, 5 words in Harlan's small, careful handwriting. You will never be alone. I read it. I read it again. The third thing was another envelope, smaller, sealed with a small dab of red wax I had never seen him use for anything. On the front of this smaller envelope, in the same handwriting, were 4 words. Open only when you are there. When you are there. There. I sat on the edge of the bed and held that envelope in my hand for what felt like a very long time. I did not know what there meant. I did not know where I was supposed to be. I did not know what was inside. I felt something twist in my chest, a kind of fear. But underneath the fear, something else. Recognition. Because I had known, somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where wives keep the things they pretend not to notice, I had known for years that Harlan had been doing something he had not told me about. And now, on the night before I was about to be put out on a sidewalk by my own children, my dead husband had reached across the divide between us and put something into my hands. I did not open the sealed envelope. I put it back into the larger one along with the photograph and the slip of paper, and I slid the whole thing into the side pocket of my blue suitcase. I closed the drawer. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The morning of the move, I woke at 5. I made coffee in the kitchen for the last time. I drank it standing up, looking out at the balcony. The ferns were still there. Murray had said, weeks earlier, that she would take good care of them. I knew she would not. I had packed my 1 suitcase and my 2 cardboard boxes the night before. In them were the books I had chosen. The Burgundy Wedding Album, the watercolor of Lincolnton, my mother's floral tablecloth, a few photographs of the boys when they were small, Harlan's old flannel jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of him. The envelope, that was all. The rest stayed. Roderick arrived at 10:30. He came alone. Murray was at a job site. He hugged me at the door. The hug lasted exactly the appropriate length of time. Not short enough to seem indifferent. Not long enough to be felt. He said, "If you need anything, Mom." I did not respond, because there was no adequate response to that. I rode the elevator down with the suitcase, and then I went back up for the boxes. I stacked everything on the sidewalk. I called the taxi. The taxi was 4 minutes away, and in those 4 minutes, I did what I told you about. I stood on the sidewalk with my hands on the suitcase. I looked up at the 8th floor window. I said goodbye, in the silence inside my chest, to the woman I had been. The neighbors stared. They thought I was confused, but I was not confused. I was beginning. The taxi arrived. The driver helped me with the suitcase. I asked him to take me to a small motel called the Hollow Creek Inn on the 2-lane highway outside Boone. He looked at me strangely. He said, "Ma'am, that's an hour and a half from here." I said, "I know." He said, "All right." I sat in the back seat and watched Asheville disappear behind me. I had $3,800 in my checking account. I had Harlan's Forest Service pension, which would begin arriving sometime soon. I had a blue suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes, an envelope I had not opened, and 35 acres of dense forest that my sons had called worthless. I had no plan. I had no map, but I had something I had not had in a very long time. I had a direction. The motel was clean. The room had a view of the Blue Ridge through a single window. I unpacked. I hung the watercolor of Lincolnton above the small desk. I put the wedding album on the nightstand. I sat down on the bed. I took out my phone. There was a name and a number in my contacts that Harlan had given me years ago, with no explanation. He had said, "This is Wendell. If you ever need anything in the mountains, he's good." I had never called Wendell. I had never had a reason. I scrolled to the number now. I dialed. The phone rang 4 times. A man's voice answered, low, slow, the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime outdoors. He said, "Hawthorne." I said, "Mr. Hawthorne, my name is Eleanor Pemberton. My husband was Harlan Pemberton." There was a pause, a long pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. And then Wendell Hawthorne, in a voice that had changed entirely, said, "Mrs. Pemberton." He said, "I have been waiting for this call." I did not understand what he meant, but I understood that something was beginning, something Harlan had set in motion years before he died. I said, "Mr. Hawthorne, I would like to see the land." He said, "I can take you Thursday morning, 7 o'clock. Meet me in front of the Watauga County Courthouse. Wear good shoes. The trail is 20 minutes in." I said, "I'll be there." He said, "Mrs. Pemberton." I said, "Yes." He said, "Your husband talked about you every single time he came up here. Every time. I just thought you should know that." I did not answer. I could not. I set down the phone. Wendell Hawthorne was 67 years old. He drove a green Ford pickup truck that smelled of diesel and pine resin and 40 years of working outdoors. He was waiting in front of the Watauga County Courthouse at 7 o'clock on Thursday morning, exactly when he said he would be, leaning against the truck with his arms crossed, watching the mist roll down off the ridges in long pale curtains. I parked the rental car I had picked up the day before, a small white sedan that felt foolish next to his truck. He pushed off the truck. He said, "Mrs. Pemberton." I said, "Mr. Hawthorne." He said, "Please." "Wendell." I said, "Then Nora." He nodded. He opened the passenger door for me. I climbed in. He drove. The road went up and out of Boone and into the foothills. The Blue Ridge Mountains opened around us like a slow exhale, white oak, hemlock, the kind of October light that only happens in the southern Appalachians, where the air thins out and the colors deepen. Wendell did not talk for the first 20 minutes, which I appreciated, but somewhere around mile 15, on a stretch of road that ran along a creek, he cleared his throat. The way men do when they are about to say something they have been rehearsing. He said, "Harlan was the finest species cataloger I ever worked with." I said, "Yes?" He said, "Not the fastest, not the most published, the finest. There's a difference." I said, "I know." He said, "In the last few years, he would disappear sometimes a weekend, a week, come back with photographs and samples. I never could quite figure out where he'd been collecting from." He paused. He said, "I think I figured it out now." I looked at him. He looked at the road. He said, "The last time I came up here with him must have been 2 years before he passed." He stood out there looking at the trees with this expression. I couldn't name it at the time, but I can now. He said, "It was the look of a man who was finishing something." We left the truck at a dirt pull-off from the state road. There was no sign, just an old wooden post with the paint long faded. Wendell got out first. He walked around to my side. He opened my door. He extended his hand. I almost refused it, because I am 72, not 92. But then I saw his eyes. It was not pity. It was the gesture of a man offering respect to the widow of his friend. I took his hand. I stepped down. He pointed to a place in the trees where I could not see anything that looked like a trail. He said, 20 minutes in. Watch your footing. There's roots. He started walking. I followed. In 10 steps, the road was behind us. In 20 steps, the sound of traffic vanished. By the time I had counted to 100, I could no longer hear anything that belonged to the world I had come from. There was only the forest, wet leaves underfoot, the smell of resin and moss and damp earth, birdsong I could not name, a creek somewhere off to the right, running steady. The kind of October cold that gets under a flannel jacket if you are not moving fast enough, so I moved faster. My right knee began to ache. It had been aching since I was 65. I ignored it. We walked. The trail rose, then leveled, then curved. I could feel the envelope in the side pocket of my small backpack, the one I had not opened. I had brought it with me that morning. 17 minutes in, Wendell stopped. He turned around. He looked at me. He said, "Nora, you ready?" I looked past him. The trail curved between two large white oaks that had grown side by side. Their branches had reached toward each other over decades and now nearly touched overhead, forming a kind of natural arch. Beyond the arch, the trail bent. I could not see what was on the other side. I rubbed my thumb across my wedding band. I said, "I'm ready." We walked through the arch, and then I saw it. Let me describe what I saw. But understand, there is no description that will do it justice, because what I saw was not a house, it was not architecture, it was not a structure. It was a sentence. It was a sentence my husband had been writing for 27 years, in wood, in silence, without telling me. It was a sentence that said, "I love you," in a language I did not know he had been speaking. The house stood in a small clearing. The clearing was not so much cleared as agreed upon, a space where the forest had pulled back just enough to let something exist alongside it. The walls were white oak, the same white oak that grew on every ridge in this part of the Blue Ridge, but cut and dried and joined with a kind of precision that turned raw wood into something else, honey-colored, glowing in the morning light. The roof was standing seam metal, weathered to a deep green, so integrated with the canopy above that you could almost miss it. 2 solar panels sat in a hand-welded iron frame, painted green to match. The house was L-shaped. The main body faced east. A shorter wing extended south. There were 4 windows on the front. Each one had a wooden planter box beneath the sill, and from each planter, ferns cascaded downward in green curtains, a full foot or more. The front door was solid white oak, with hand-forged iron hinges, and in the upper panel, when you stepped close enough to see it, there was a carved relief of oak leaves. I stood at the edge of the clearing. I did not move. I could not. Wendell came up beside me. He stayed 3 steps back. He said nothing, because the house was already saying everything. I want you to understand. I want you to understand what it is to stand at the edge of a clearing in the woods at 72 years old, 3 months after your husband has died, and to see in front of you a house he built, a house he never told you about, a house that has been waiting for you for 27 years. There is no language for this. I started to cry. Wendell did not move toward me. He did not touch my shoulder. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He just stood there, 3 steps back, letting me arrive. When I could move again, I walked across the clearing. I reached the door. I put my hand on the iron latch. It was warm from the sun. I lifted it. The latch clicked. The door opened with a sound I will remember until I die. A soft, well-fitted sound. I stepped inside. The smell came first. Wood. Clean, dry wood. with an undertone of linseed oil, and beneath that, deeper the smell of earth and resin and green things coming in through ventilation gaps designed into the walls. The main room was about 20 feet by 26. The ceiling was high, higher than it needed to be, because Harlan had known, because Harlan had remembered that I had said once, 15 years ago, that I did not like rooms with low ceilings. He had remembered. He had built that into the walls. The floor was yellow birch, laid in a herringbone pattern, smooth and matte with age, but whole, without a single flaw I could see. 3 large windows ran along the east wall, with interior shutters. The light coming through them was forest light, not direct, filtered through the canopy outside until it arrived soft and golden. And against the far wall, floor to ceiling, built into the structure itself, was a bookshelf. I counted later about 2,500 volumes, organized by subject, within subject by author, within author by date: botany, silviculture, Appalachian ecology, environmental law, natural history, and, interspersed, the novels and poetry he reread. Wendell Berry, Annie Dillard, a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea with a spine so broken it looked like it had been read 30 times, which it probably had. In the left corner of the shelf, at my eye level, was a row of photograph albums, bound in brown leather, numbered on the spines in pencil. I counted 11. I pulled the first one. I sat down on a wooden bench beneath the east window. I opened the album on my lap. The first photographs were of a clearing, this clearing, but empty. No house. Just a circular space where the forest had been thinned, stakes in the ground. A surveyor's tape. The date stamped beneath the photographs was 1994. Roderick had been 17, Cyrus had been 14, I had been 42. I had been folding shirts, watering ferns, cooking dinners, believing that my husband's weekend absences were field surveys for the Forest Service, believing that the marriage I was inside of was the only marriage there was. And the whole time, the entire time, Harlan had been building this. I turned the page. I saw a foundation going in, hand-laid stone. The next page, a wall frame. The next, a roof going up. The boys were growing, year by year, in the dates on the photographs. I closed the album. I sat with it on my lap for a long time. I walked through the rest of the house slowly. The kitchen, with a propane stove and a sink and open shelves full of cast iron pans, Harlan must have hauled in himself. The bedroom, the bed was made with a quilt on it that I recognized. It was the wedding quilt my mother had sewn for us in 1975. I had thought it was in storage. I had thought it was lost. It was here, on a bed in a house in a forest that my husband had built for me, that I had not known existed. I sat down on the edge of that bed, and I felt for the first time in 3 months something that was not grief, and was not anger, and was not fear. It was something I had not felt in so long I had almost forgotten the name of it. It was being known. I went into the study last. The study was in the L wing of the house, smaller than the other rooms. With one window facing east, there was a large desk, 3 walls of bookshelves, a leather chair that had clearly been Harlan's chair, worn on the right arm, where his elbow would have rested. On the desk were field notebooks, 22 of them, leather-covered, spiral-bound, spanning 1994 to 2019. And in the center of the desk was a blue folder. I sat down in Harlan's chair. I opened the folder. The first set of documents was a species inventory. 14 native plant species documented as vulnerable or threatened under federal guidelines. Among them, 3 species of trillium found only at this altitude and humidity, a stand of Fraser fir that should not have survived this far south but had, and one entry on a page by itself that I read 3 times. American chestnut, Castanea dentata, 3 mature specimens, confirmed fruiting in 2006, previously declared functionally extinct in the southern Appalachians. Functionally extinct, meaning the species had not produced a mature reproducing tree in this region in over 70 years. Until Harlan. Harlan had found 3 of them on this land, and he had kept it secret for 15 years, because if he had published, the location would have become public, and the trees would have been at risk. The second set of documents was financial, a pre-approved application to the Appalachian Private Conservation Trust, a private organization that paid landowners to maintain ecologically critical forest $42,000 a year for life, indexed to inflation. A formal proposal from the Department of Ecology at Western Carolina University, signed by Dr. Adelina Brockwell, to lease research access to the land for $35,000 a year, a 10-year contract, a preliminary carbon credit valuation from a firm called Cascade Carbon Trust, estimating the total sequestration value of the reforested acreage at $420,000 over 30 years. A letter from a small water licensing company in Boone, offering an informal valuation for the natural mineral spring on the property, $18,000 to $25,000 a year in royalties. I closed the folder. I sat back in Harlan's chair, and I started to laugh. Not a happy laugh. A laugh of pure, unfiltered amazement. Underneath all the documents, at the bottom of the folder, was a letter. Not typed, not in an envelope, just folded once in Harlan's small, careful blue ink. The letter was addressed to me. It began, Nora. It said, Nora, you are sitting somewhere in this house right now, maybe at the table, maybe in the bedroom. I hope it is the study, because from the study you can see the east window. And the east window has a white oak outside it with a resurrection fern that greens up every time it rains. I do not know if it will be raining when you get here, but if it is, the fern will be green. And I wanted you to see that. I want to start at the beginning, because you deserve the whole beginning. In April of 1994, I was on a field survey for the Forest Service. I had a flat tire on the state road. I changed it, and while I stood there, I noticed a trail going into the woods that was not on any of my maps. You know my flaw, Nora. I cannot leave a trail without walking it. 20 minutes in, I found this clearing. I do not know if you have ever had the experience of entering a place and feeling that it was waiting for you. It is a sensation without an adequate name. It is not intuition. It is recognition. As though you had seen the place before. In a dream you cannot recall, but your body remembers. I bought the land in November of 1994. 35 acres, conservation zone. No one wanted it. The asking price was low. I paid cash from savings I had set aside over the years. I did not tell you, because at that time, I did not yet know what I would do with it. Later, when I knew, I decided I wanted it to be a surprise. I know you spent your whole life suspecting I kept secrets. I did, but it was never anything that could hurt you. It was always this. I was always building here. The construction took 27 years because I built when I could, how I could. I learned carpentry out of necessity and became good at it out of stubbornness. Why did I not tell you? I tried, several times. But each time I came close, something stopped me. The main thing was this. I knew what the boys would do. If you knew about the house, they would know too. And I could not trust that they would leave it alone. So I decided it was better for you to find it after I was gone. When the paperwork was settled, when they had already taken the apartment and the accounts and signed off on everything and could not go back. Nora, I need to tell you one more thing, and I will try to say it without fumbling, because I was always better with wood than with words. I married you in March of 1975, and you were the best thing that ever happened in my life. I am not saying this the way people say it in letters. I am saying it the way a person says it. When they have spent 50 years looking at a piece of evidence and checking the math again, and the math always comes out the same. You were the best thing. You were more than I deserved, and far better than I knew how to say while I was alive. I built this house thinking of you the entire time. The windows face east because you always loved mornings. The bed is on your side because the right side was always yours. The shelves hold the books I know you will want to read. You were never forgotten, Nora. You were never left behind. You were protected. They got the apartment. You got the forest, and the forest was always worth more. With all the love a whole life can hold. Harlem, P.S. The resurrection fern on the east window dries up and looks dead in drought. But give it one good rain, and it comes back green in a single day. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it. I put it back in the envelope. I looked out the east window. The fern was there. It had not rained in a week. The fern was dry and brown and curled tight against the bark. Small, still, waiting. I rubbed my thumb across my wedding band, not nervously, saying thank you. And then I put both hands flat on the desk and wept. I stayed. Of course I stayed. I do not remember making the decision. I do not remember saying the words out loud. But I did. By Saturday night, I was sleeping in a bed my mother had quilted for, in a bedroom my husband had built for me, in a house my sons did not know existed. The first 2 weeks, I did nothing. I made coffee in the morning on Harlan's propane stove, with water from the rainwater system he had built into the roof. I carried the coffee to the table in the main room. I sat with one of the books from the shelf. I read. While the forest light changed through the day, I had not done this in 50 years. I had not done a single thing for 50 years that was not first arranged around someone else's needs. The breakfast for the boys, the lunchbox notes, the dinner timed for Harlan's return, the laundry on Tuesday, the grocery list on Wednesday, the bills on Thursday. I had spent 50 years on a schedule that was never mine, and now there was no schedule. There was only the light and the books and the silence, which was not really silence. There were birds, there was wind in the high branches, there was the creek I had not yet found, but which I would find on the 9th day, 200 yards behind the house. I sat by that creek with my boots off and my feet in the cold water and thought about nothing for a very long time, which was something I had not done in decades, possibly ever. Wendell came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the way he had done for 27 years. He never knocked. He came to the door and stood until I noticed him. Then he said good morning and went to work on whatever he saw needed doing. A loose board on the porch step, the solar panel connection that had corroded at one terminal, the vegetable garden behind the house. On the 3rd Tuesday, I followed him to the garden. I asked if I could help. He handed me a pair of gloves, without looking up, pointed to the bed nearest the house. I knelt in the dirt. I began pulling, and within 5 minutes I had torn out a row of young basil plants. I had mistaken them for weeds. Wendell walked over. He looked at the wilted basil in my gloved hand. He looked at me. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a voice that carried no judgment, he said, "Those were the basil." I felt the heat rise in my face. I waited for him to take over, to do the thing well-meaning people do when they decide you are too old to be trusted with a task. Wendell reached into the pocket of his vest. He pulled out a seed packet. He held it out to me. The label read, "Sweet Basil." His eyes were steady, carrying no pity. He said, "Today is a good day to replant." I took the packet. I replanted. The morning rain came on the 11th day. It started before dawn, a steady, gentle Appalachian rain, the kind that arrives without wind. When the rain eased, I got up, I made coffee, I walked into the study. I looked at the east window. The fern was green. I want you to understand, not partially green, not slightly green, green, as if someone had painted it overnight. The brown curls had loosened and flattened and unfurled into bright, living leaves. In one rain, in a few hours, I put my hand on the glass. I said, out loud, to no one. I said, "You waited." I understood. For the first time, fully. What Harlan had been building, it was not a house. It was a second life. He had built me a second life. And he had hidden it in a forest my sons would never bother to walk through, so that no one could take it from me. Marigold Hawthorne came on the third Friday. She was 64 years old, Wendell's wife. She arrived at the door with a Dutch oven full of chicken and dumplings. She did not knock either. She came up the porch steps, set the Dutch oven on the railing, knocked the mud off her boots, and opened the door. She said, "Wendell forgot to tell me you were coming." I said, "I am sorry to surprise you." She said, "No, ma'am, I am not surprised. I am annoyed at my husband. There is a difference." She walked past me into the kitchen. She put the Dutch oven on the stove. She turned around. She looked at me. She looked at me the way women of a certain age look at each other when they have decided in the first 3 seconds that there will be no nonsense between them. She said, "Nora." I said, "Yes." She said, "You eat with me, right now, because I made too much, and you are too thin, and Harlan would haunt me if I let you eat alone tonight." I ate. I ate until I could not eat anymore. And then Marigold sat across from me at the table, with her elbows on the wood, and she said in a voice that did not pretend to be soft, she said, "Harlan talked about you every single time he came here." I did not say anything. She said, "Every time. Wendell would come home and tell me the things Harlan said. After a while, I felt like I knew you before I ever met you. I knew you liked mornings and libraries and serviceberry trees, and that you had a way of being quiet that was not empty, but full." She paused. She said, "He told us you were the strongest person he ever knew, and that nobody could see it, because you were so quiet about it." I said, "Thank you, Marigold." She said, "Don't thank me." I didn't say it. He did. I'm just the one telling you he said it. She came every Friday after that. She brought too much food every time. The friendship between us grew with the speed of things that do not need to be forced. The quilting group found me in March of 2025. Marigold brought me to it by telling me I was going and then driving me there. It was 4 women. They met on Wednesday afternoons at a converted church in the valley. Willa Stroud ran the post office. Gretchen Danner raised goats and made soap from their milk. Frances Honeycutt had taught 4th grade for 38 years and still called everyone honey. They accepted me without ceremony. Willa handed me a needle. Gretchen showed me the pattern. Frances poured me a cup of bad coffee and patted my hand and called me honey. They talked about weather, grandchildren, the price of feed, the county commissioner who had rezoned agricultural land for a gas station in which they called several things I will not repeat. They said exactly what they thought, with the precision of women who had run out of patience for indirectness sometime around the age of 55. I had spent decades being the quietest person in every room. Here, my quietness was not a deficit, it was a contribution. I was. There is no other word for it. I was home. The researchers from Western Carolina arrived in February. Jasper, 28, with the seriousness of someone who wanted to be the next Harlan Pemberton, and Siwersh, 25, who could name every fern on the property in Latin, and who, in her first week, found in the northeast section of the forest a fourth American chestnut mature. In full flower, she came running to the house. She was crying. Not sad crying. The crying of a scientist who has just witnessed something her field has been mourning for 70 years. She said, "Mrs. Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton, there are 4, not 3, 4. I sat with her on the porch. I let her cry. I made her tea. I thought about Harlan. I wondered if he had known. About the 4th tree, or if he had left it for someone else to find." It was on a Tuesday evening in late March that Roderick called. I was on the porch with a cup of tea and one of Harlan's field notebooks open on my lap. I had started reading them in order, treating them as the diary Harlan had never called them, but which they were. Roderick's number appeared on the screen. I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I answered. He said, "Mom," the voice I recognized, the reasonableness register, the one he had been using since he was 15 and wanted to negotiate his curfew. He said, "How are you? We've been trying to reach you for weeks." I said, "I have been out of signal range." A pause. He said, "You're at the property." I said, "I am." Another pause, this one carrying the weight of strategy being assembled in real time. He said, "Mom, we found out some things about the land Dad had. There is more to it than it looked. We would like to talk." I said, "How long have you known?" He said, "We found out a few weeks ago. Cyrus has a contact in environmental consulting who mentioned the property in connection with a federal filing." I said, "I see." He said, "We didn't know, Mom. If we had, the division would have been different. We would not have left you with." I said, "Roderick." I said it quietly. He stopped. I said, "I am going to say something." Once, there was silence on the other end. I said, "Your father left exactly what he intended for each person. You received the apartment and the investments, legal in the will, signed by both of you, without contest." I said, "I received the land, legal in the will, signed by both of you. When you said it was worthless woods, with no access," I paused. "I said it was not worthless. It was what your father spent his life building for me." And he explained, very clearly, in his letter, why he did not tell anyone sooner. Roderick said, "Mom," I said, "Let me finish." He stopped again. I said, "I will not contest the will. I will not ask for revision. But I also will not share anything that is here, because there is nothing to share. Everything on this land belongs to me, was planned to belong to me, is properly documented and registered." Another pause. I said, "If you want to maintain contact as my sons, the door is open." I said, "If you want to maintain contact as unsatisfied heirs, you will need an attorney other than yourself, because a lawsuit between a son and a mother is something most judges view with very little sympathy, and you know that better than I do." Long silence. I said, "You got the apartment, I got the forest, and the forest is worth more. That is not bitterness. It is simply what happened." Roderick did not answer immediately. When he spoke, The voice had shifted to something closer to the real thing, stripped of the negotiation register. He said, "Mom, we made a mistake." I said, "You did." He said, "Can we talk about that separately from the land question?" I said, "When you are ready." I paused. I said, "Come here. 20 minutes on the trail from the state road. Wendell will show you the way." And something softer entered my voice. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the door left unlocked. I said, "It is a beautiful place. Your father built it with care. You should see it." I hung up. I placed the phone on the porch railing. I picked up my tea. I sat, looking at the white oaks. I felt peace. Not the peace of having won something, the peace of being exactly where I needed to be. The phone did not ring again for 2 weeks. And then on a Tuesday in mid-April it did, but not from Roderick. From Emotion Thorpe, my attorney. She said, "Nora." I said, "Yes." She said, "Roderick has filed a motion in Watauga County Superior Court through a litigation firm in Charlotte. He is requesting judicial review of the estate division on the grounds that the true value of the property was not disclosed at the time of probate." I closed my eyes. I said, "Of course he did." Imogen said, "Nora, I want you to listen to me before you say anything." I said, "All right." She said, "Your husband anticipated this." I said, "I did not say anything." She said the will was filed with a notary in 2018, witnessed by 2 independent parties, notarized, fully legally valid. Both sons signed the probate acknowledgement in December of 2024, confirming their acceptance of the distribution as stated. Imogen Pause. She said, "This motion will not survive a preliminary hearing." I opened my eyes. I said, "Thank you, Imogen." I hung up. I sat for a moment. The legal crisis was contained. Harlan had seen to that. But I want you to understand what filing a lawsuit against your 72-year-old mother does to a mother. Even when the lawsuit is going to fail, it does something. It teaches you with perfect clarity what your son is willing to do to people he says he loves. And once you have learned that, you cannot unlearn it. The storm came in September of 2025. A year, almost exactly, since the day I had first walked into the forest with Wendell. I noticed it first in the barometric pressure, a heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had lowered closer to the ground. The birds went quiet by mid-morning, which Wendell had taught me was the most reliable weather forecast in the mountains. By noon, the sky over the Blue Ridge was a color I had not seen in a year of watching, a bruised yellow-green that seemed to pulse with energy being held back. Wendell came to the house at 2 in the afternoon, which was not a Tuesday or a Thursday. That alone told me what I needed to know. He said, "There is a remnant of a hurricane coming up from the Atlantic. Could be 11 inches of rain in 16 hours, maybe more." He paused. He said, "The creeks are already high. The ground is saturated." We brought the porch furniture inside, fastened the storm shutters, cleared the drainage channels. Wendell offered to stay. I told him to go home, to Marigold. The storm arrived at 11 that night. I was in bed, listening. The wind came first. It was not the wind of Asheville winters that rattled the apartment windows. It was something deeper, the sound of air being displaced by force across a mountain ridge. Then the rain, not rain as I understood rain, but rain as event, as assault, as a volume of water being delivered to the earth, with a weight that was audible. I lay in the dark. I did not sleep, and somewhere in the deep middle of the night, I heard a sound that was different, a sound that came from outside and below and had a finality to it. The sound of a large tree falling, not a crack and a crash. A slow, groaning surrender, roots losing their grip on saturated soil, the trunk leaning past the point of return, branches catching and snapping, and then the impact, a deep, concussive thud. That I felt through the floor of the house. By morning, the storm had passed east. I opened the front door. I stood on the porch. I looked. The damage was substantial. Two large, white oaks on the west side of the clearing had come down, one across the path that led to the creek, one against the corner of the south wing, where it had struck the roof and broken through, opening a gap 3 feet wide, through which I could see the sky inside the house. The garden was destroyed. The serviceberry orchard had lost 2 trees. The trail to the state road was blocked. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the damage, not panic, something closer to the sensation of a test being administered. I went inside. I made coffee. I carried it to the porch. I sat in the rocking chair. And then my phone buzzed, a notification. I opened it. It was a copy of the legal filing, Roderick's motion, officially served. His attorney had not waited for the storm. I sat in the rocking chair, 72 years old, in a damaged house, in a damaged forest, with a legal filing from my eldest son. I rubbed my thumb across my wedding band. I sat very still for 11 minutes. I counted them afterward because I wanted to remember exactly how long it took me to decide what kind of woman I was going to be on the other side of this morning. I called Wendell first. He answered from his truck, already on his way. I called Marigold. She said, "I am bringing food. Don't argue." I called Jasper. He said he and Soyars would come with the university's emergency equipment. And I called Imogen. I said, "The motion will not survive a hearing. You said so." She said, "It will not." I said, "Then let it fall, like the trees." She laughed. She said, "Nora, I'll handle it." I hung up. I stood on the porch with the phone in my hand. And I realized something for the first time in my entire life. I was not standing alone. Not because I had been weak, but because I had learned in a year of gardens and storms and Friday conversations and Wednesday quilting circles, that standing alone and standing with others were not opposites. They were the same strength, expressed in 2 directions. They arrived through the morning, Wendell first, with his chainsaw and his steady hands, then Jasper and Sauersay with ropes and tarps from the university field station, then Marigold with a cooler of food, then by noon, others, Willa Stroud from the post office, with her husband, and a come-along winch, Gretchen Danner, who brought nothing but herself, Frances Honeycutt, who brought a thermos of coffee and organized the branch clearing with the effortless authority of a woman who had managed 35 fourth graders for 38 years. I did not stand on the porch and watch. I worked. I hauled branches alongside Gretchen. I held the guide rope while Wendell cut the oak into sections. I carried the cut rounds to the woodpile. At one point, I stood at the woodpile with sawdust on Harlan's jacket and sweat on my forehead and my right knee aching. But I carried them. I looked at my hands. They were dirty. The nails were short and rough. The wedding band was scratched from the work. And for a moment, I thought about the woman who had stood on the sidewalk in Asheville with a blue suitcase and clean hands and no idea what was waiting. That woman would not have recognized this one. And this one, I thought, was better. By late afternoon, the oak was cleared, the roof gap was covered with a tarp, the study floor was swept and drying. We ate on the porch at dusk, all of us eating Marigold's chicken stew and Willa's cornbread. Francis, leaving last. Stopped at the edge of the clearing, turned back. She said, Nora. I said, yes. She said, you know what Harlan built you? I said, what? She said, he did not just build you a house. He built you a neighborhood. She walked into the trees. The preliminary hearing was held in Watauga County Superior Court on a Thursday in late October. I did not attend. Imogen went on my behalf, she called afterward. The motion had been dismissed. The judge had reviewed the probate records, confirmed that both sons had signed the distribution acknowledgement without reservation, and concluded that no grounds existed for judicial review. The judge had made an off-the-record comment that the motion was, in his words, the kind of filing that makes the legal profession look bad. Roderick called that evening. His voice was different, stripped further, quieter. He said, Mom. I said, yes. He said, I dropped the suit. I said, I know. He said, I want to come. Not about the land, not about the money, just to see it, just to see what Dad built. I looked at the east window. The resurrection fern was dry again, brown, curled. I said, come. Roderick arrived on a Saturday in early November of 2025, alone, without Mirai. He drove a sedan that was entirely wrong for the fire road, and he wore shoes that would not survive the trail. But he came. Wendell met him at the pull-off and walked him in. I stood on the porch and watched my son emerge from the trees into the clearing, 48 years old, thinner than I remembered. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the house. His face did something I had not seen it do since he was a child. It opened. He stood there for a long time, without speaking. Then he walked to the nearest wall, and he put his hand flat against the wood. I brought him inside. He moved through each room slowly. He stood in front of the bookshelf for a long time. He pulled down the first photograph album. He turned the pages slowly, looking at the images of the land in 1994. He looked at a photograph of Harlan standing beside a half-finished door frame, holding a level, grinning. His voice was rough and low. He said, he did this every weekend. He said, every weekend for 27 years. He said, and he never said a word. I said, he said a word. He looked up at me. I said, he said it in the wood. He said it in every window. He pointed east. I said, you just had to come here to hear it. He sat down on the wooden bench beneath the east window. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I came back. I put a cup beside him. I sat in Harlan's leather chair. We did not speak for a while. And then Roderick said, he said, Mom, I need to tell you something. I said, all right. He said, Murray moved out. I said, when? He said, 3 weeks ago. I said, I am sorry. He said, you don't have to be. He said, I think she was the kind of person you become if you are not careful about who you spend your life with. He said, I am 48 years old, and I just realized I don't know who I am, without her telling me. I said nothing. He looked at me. He said, Mom, I am so sorry. He said, for the apartment, for the 90 days, for dinner at our house, for Cyrus and the link to Magnolia Gardens, for all of it. He said, I don't know how you forgive a person for what we did. I looked at him. I said, Roderick, I said, I am not the person who has to forgive you. He looked at me. I said, your father is, and he is not here to do it. So you are going to have to find a way to live with what you did. Without being forgiven by the one person who could, he started to cry, quietly, without sound. The way men cry when they have finally let something through that they have been holding for a long time. I did not move toward him. I let him cry, because some things you have to do alone, even when someone is sitting right next to you. Then I stood up. I went to the desk. I opened the drawer where I had kept it for almost a year. I took out the second envelope, the one I had found in August when the storm was coming, tucked inside Harlan's 2019 notebook, with a seal I had not broken until that night, alone on the porch, with the legal filings still glowing in my phone. The letter Harlan had written in August of 2020, a year before he finished the house. I had not shown it to anyone. I had been keeping it. For this, I walked back across the room. I sat down beside my son. I put the envelope in his hand. I said, "Read this." He looked at me. I said, "Your father wrote it 5 years ago, about you and your brother." He opened the envelope. The letter said, "Nora, if you are reading this, something has happened. Maybe something with the boys. Maybe a storm. Maybe both. I do not know the shape of it, but I know the nature of it. I want to tell you something I never told you while I was alive. I did not build this house because I did not trust the boys. I built it because I did not trust myself. I was a silent father, Nora. I thought building was a kind of speaking. I thought working was a kind of love. I thought providing was the same as telling them I loved them. I was wrong. My silence taught them silence. And now they treat you the way I was afraid they would. This house is not just my apology to you. It is my apology to them. The letter I never wrote, the conversation I never had, the hand I never put on their shoulder when they were 8 and 12 and 20. If one of them comes here one day, let them come not to share the forest, but to see, finally, what their father did not know how to say. Tell them, from me, that I should have spoken sooner. Tell them, from me, that I am sorry I am not there to tell them myself. And tell them, Nora, tell them you are my best work. Tell them I would have built 1,000 houses to keep you in the world. But I only had time to build this one. Hut. Roderick finished reading. He folded the letter. He did not look up. He sat with the paper in his hands for a long time. And then he did something I had not seen him do since he was 12 years old. He slid off the bench onto the floor, just down to the floor, with his back against the bench and his head in his hands. I sat above him. I did not move. I did not speak. I let the silence sit between us. The kind of silence Harlan had been trying his whole life to find words for and could not. After a long time, Roderick said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." He said, "Where is Cyrus?" I said, "Cyrus has not come." He said, "Will he?" I said, "I do not know." He looked up at me. His eyes were red. He said, "Mom, what do I do?" I said, "You cannot make him come. I cannot make him come." I said, "Your father waited 27 years for me to find this house. He waited because he believed I would find it. When I was ready," I said, "I can wait for Cyrus. The same way." He nodded. Slowly, he stood up. He wiped his face on the sleeve of his jacket. He said, "Can I come back next month?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I bring my children?" I looked at him. I said, "You have not brought my grandchildren to see me in nearly 2 years." He said, "I know." I said, "Then bring them. The trail is 20 minutes. It is exactly the right amount of trail for children." He smiled, a small smile, the first real one I had seen on his face in maybe a decade. He said, "I will bring them." He left that afternoon. At the edge of the clearing, he turned back. He said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for letting me see it." He walked into the trees. A year after I had first walked into them myself, Roderick came back in December with both children. They were shy at first. They had not known what to do with a grandmother who lived in a forest. By Sunday, they had found the creek. They had named the chickens. They had decided they would be coming back. He came again in January and February, but Cyrus did not call. Cyrus did not write. Cyrus had been silent for 10 months, for longer than that, for decades, really, if I was being honest. The kind of silence that is not absence, the kind that is choice. Choice, made every day, to not call, to not write, to not come. I did not chase him. I had learned from a husband who had waited 27 years that waiting was not weakness. Waiting was a kind of trust. Trust that the door left open would eventually be walked through by the right person at the right time on their own legs. The fourth Friday in March came with a cold snap that surprised the mountains. Marigold called it a stubborn winter. She brought me a pot of beef stew and a jar of honey from Gretchen's hives, and a piece of news that I had not expected. She set the stew on the stove. She turned around. She said, "Nora, sit down." I said, "What is it?" She said, "Sit down first." I sat. She said, "Cyrus called Wendell yesterday." I felt my hands go still in my lap. I said, "Cyrus called Wendell." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "He wanted to know how to get here." I did not say anything for a moment. I said, "When is he coming?" Marigold said, "Saturday." I said, "This Saturday." She said, "This Saturday." I said, "That is tomorrow." She said, "That is tomorrow." I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, "Marigold." She said, "Yes." I said, "I do not know if I am ready." She did not flinch. She did not say, "Of course you are ready. Of course you can do this." She did not say any of the soft things people say when they are trying to make you feel better. She said, "Of course you are not ready. Nobody is ever ready for the second son, the first son you get used to. The second son you have to relearn." I almost laughed. She said, "Nora, he is coming. That is what matters. You will be ready, because you have no choice." That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed in the room Harlan had built for me, with the quilt my mother had sewn in 1975 pulled up to my chin, and I stared at the ceiling. And I thought about my second son. I remembered Cyrus at 4, sitting on the kitchen floor, stacking blocks. Roderick had come over to knock them down. Cyrus had not cried. He had simply gathered the blocks, walked to another room, and started stacking again. I remembered Cyrus at 12, the summer I had taken the boys to my mother's house in Lincolnton. Mom had been declining by then. She had looked at Cyrus and called him by my brother's name. My brother, who had died in a car accident in 1962. Cyrus had not corrected her. He had just sat there, holding her hand, for 3 hours. I had been so proud of him that day. I had thought, this boy has the patience of his grandmother. I had been wrong. He did not have her patience. He had her ability to leave. He had been leaving his whole life. He had just done it quietly. And then the funeral, his father's funeral. Cyrus had been in Tokyo on business. He had flown back 16 hours, and he had been 40 minutes late to his own father's funeral. I had been standing at the front of the chapel with Roderick and the empty space beside us where Cyrus was supposed to be. The service had started without him. He had walked in during the second hymn in a wrinkled shirt with circles under his eyes, carrying a briefcase. I had not said anything to him about it, not then, not later. I had absorbed it the way I had absorbed everything else from him over the years, but absorbed is not the same as forgotten. I had carried it for 16 months, and tomorrow he was coming up the trail. I got out of bed. I went to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat at the table. In the dark, I said out loud to the empty room, I said, Harlan, help me. The room did not answer, but the resurrection fern on the east window, which had been green for a week because of the steady March rain, the fern did not need to answer. It was the answer. Saturday morning was clear, cold, but clear. I made coffee at 5. I went to the porch in Harlan's flannel jacket with a wool blanket over my lap. I watched the sun rise behind the ridge. At 7, Wendell pulled up to the pull-off. He was driving Cyrus in. I had asked him to, I had said, I do not want him to come up the trail with a stranger leading him. I want him to feel like someone is bringing him to me. The way someone brought me to this place. Wendell had said, Yes, ma'am. He had said, I'll bring him. I waited on the porch. The minutes passed. I do not know how to describe what it is. To wait for a child you have not seen in over a year, who is 45 years old, who is your son, whose silence has been a presence in your life. As large as any sound, I waited. I heard footsteps on the trail. 2 sets, Wendell's, steady, slow, practiced, and another, lighter, uneven, like someone who was not used to forest ground. The footsteps grew closer. I sat very still in the rocking chair. Wendell came around the curve first. He saw me on the porch. He raised a hand. He stepped to the side of the trail. Behind him, Cyrus. I looked at my second son. He looked older than I remembered. 45, hair starting to gray at the temples, carrying a small black duffel bag. He was wearing dress shoes. His socks had mud on them. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He saw me. I saw him. We did not speak. For a long moment, Cyrus took a breath. He took another step forward. He said, Mom. His voice cracked on the word. I did not stand up. I said, Cyrus. I said it the way I would say his name. If I were waking him up for school, if he were 6 years old, and the world was still small, he walked across the clearing. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He put down the duffel bag. He looked at me. He said, I do not know how to do this. I said, neither do I. He said, I read the letter, the one you sent to Roderick about Dad. I said, Roderick told you what was in it. He said, Roderick read it to me, over the phone, twice, in December. And then again in February. He said, I have been trying for 3 months to find the words. I said, did you find them? He said, no. He said, I came anyway. I said, Cyrus, come up here. He came up the steps. He stood on the porch in his dress shoes with mud on the socks. And then he did something I did not expect. He sat down on the porch at my feet the way he used to sit when he was 5. When he would come into the kitchen and just sit on the floor near my chair while I peeled potatoes. He would not say anything. He would just sit, sometimes for an hour. I had forgotten that. I had forgotten he used to do that. For 30 years, I had forgotten. I looked down at the top of his head. The hair was thinner than I remembered. I reached out. I put my hand on his shoulder. He put his hand on top of mine. We sat that way. For a long time, the forest was quiet. The white oaks were holding their bare branches against the cold sky. The resurrection fern was green. And after a while, Cyrus said, he said, Mom, I was 40 minutes late to Dad's funeral. I said, I know. He said I was on a client call from the rental car in the parking lot of the funeral home. For 35 minutes, I could see the chapel through the windshield. I could see Roderick standing at the door, waiting for me. He said, I told myself the client needed me. He said, the client did not need me. He said, I needed the client because the client gave me a reason not to walk in. He said, I was so afraid of walking in, of seeing you, of seeing his coffin, of being his son. He said, I have spent my whole life finding reasons not to walk in. I did not say anything, because that was a sentence a man could only say once he had finally said it. He said, Tessa filed for divorce in August. I said, what? He said, she filed in August. We have been separated since November. The papers are finalized next month. I said, Cyrus. He said, I did not tell you. I did not tell Roderick. Because telling people meant it was real. And if it was not real, I could keep pretending that I was a man who had a wife and 2 children and a career and a life that was working. He said my life was not working. He said the only thing that worked was the deals and the calls and the credit card points and the suit, the right suit for the right meeting. He said I built a kingdom out of nothing. He said Dad built a kingdom out of trees. He said Dad's kingdom is still here. He said mine is gone. I said, Cyrus, look at me. He looked up. His eyes were red. I said, your father loved you. I said, he did not say it well. He did not say it often. He said it the way fathers of his generation said it, which was, he said it in the things he did, in the trees he planted, in the silence he carried. I said, that was wrong. I said, that was not enough. I said, you needed more. I said, but he knew it. At the end, I said, he wrote it down. I went inside. I came back out with the second letter. The one I had given Roderick, I had photocopied it. The original lived in my desk now. The copies were for the boys. I held it out to Cyrus. He took it. He read it. He read it twice. When he finished, he did not say anything. He folded it. He put it back in the envelope. He held it in his hands. He said, he wrote this. I said, he wrote it. He said, in 2020. I said, in 2020. He said, before he died. I said, before he died. He said, he knew. I said, he knew. Cyrus put his head down. His shoulders shook. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders shook. For a long time, I sat in the rocking chair. I did not move. I let him cry. When he was finished, he wiped his face. He looked up at me. He said, Mom, I do not deserve to be here. I said, Cyrus. He said, I do not. I said, listen to me. I said, deserving is not the point. Deserving has never been the point. People talk about deserving the way they talk about debts, as if love is something you earn by performing the right behaviors. I said, love is not a debt. I said, love is a door. I said, your father held the door open for you for 45 years, whether you walked through or not. I said, I am holding the door open for you right now. I said, you decide whether to walk through. He looked at me. He said, what does walking through mean? I said, it means you come back. I said, not once, not for an afternoon. It means you come back again and again, the way Roderick has been coming. I said, it means you call. Not on birthdays, not when something has happened. You call when nothing has happened, the way real sons call their mothers. I said, it means you bring your children to me. before they are grown, before they are gone. I said, it means you sit on this porch through awkward silences, without filling them with calls to clients, without pretending you have somewhere else to be. I said, that is what walking through means. He was quiet. He looked out at the clearing. He looked at the chestnut at the edge, the one Roderick had planted in November. He said, Mom. I said, yes. He said, can I plant one too? I felt something turn over in my chest. I said, yes, Cyrus. I said, you can plant one too. We walked to the nursery bed behind the house. Sorsha had been propagating chestnut seedlings. There were 6 in the bed now, each one about 2 feet tall. Cyrus knelt down in his dress pants. He picked up one of the bags. He held it carefully, the way you would hold a sleeping infant. He said, where do I plant it? I pointed. I said, near the chestnut Roderick planted. There is room there, so the 2 of them grow up together. He carried the seedling to the spot. I brought the shovel. He dug the hole, carefully, the way a man digs when he understands that this is the only thing he can offer, and it has to be done right. He placed the seedling. He filled in the dirt around the root ball. He pressed the soil with his hands. He stood up. His knees were muddy. His hands were black with earth. He looked at me. He said, what do I do now? I said, water it. He said, where? I said, the creek, 200 yards behind the house. Take the bucket from the porch. He walked. He came back with the bucket. He poured the water slowly around the base. The water disappeared into the soil. The seedling stood, small, thin, with 4 bright green leaves at the top. A tree that would need 50 years to bear fruit, 100 to reach its full height. A tree that Cyrus would not see in its mature form, that his children might see, that his grandchildren almost certainly would. He stood beside it, looking down. He said, Mom? I said, yes. He said, I want to bring my kids to see this. I said, when? He said, next month. They are with Tessa right now, but I have them for spring break. I said, bring them. He said, both of them. I said, both of them. He looked at me. He said, what if they do not want to come? I said, they will want to come. He said, how do you know? I said, because they have been waiting their whole lives for someone to take them somewhere that is not an airport or a hotel or a restaurant. Take them here. Let them get dirty. I said, they will want to come. He said, okay. He stayed for the weekend. He slept in the guest room, the small room off the kitchen, the one Harlan had built last. We did not talk about big things on Saturday night. We had said what needed to be said. Now we did the work of being in the same space. Without performing, I made dinner, vegetable soup from the cellar, and cornbread from Willa's recipe. Cyrus chopped the carrots. He was bad at it. The pieces were uneven. He laughed about it, which was a sound I had not heard from him in maybe 10 years. Sunday morning. Wendell came to drive him back to the pull-off. Cyrus stood at the edge of the clearing with his duffel bag. He looked at the house. He said, Mom? I said, yes. He said, can I take a picture? I said, yes. He took out his phone. He took a photograph of the house, of the porch, of the white oaks, of the chestnut he had planted. Then he turned the camera around. He said, Mom, stand here. I stood beside him. He held out the phone. He took a photograph of the 2 of us. He looked at the photograph. He said, this is the first picture of us together. In maybe 8 years. I said, I know. He said, I am going to print it. I said, please do. He said, I am going to hang it on my wall. I said, please do. He hugged me. The hug was not perfect. It was awkward. He was taller than me by 10 inches. He did not quite know where to put his arms, but it was a hug. It lasted long enough to be felt. He said, "I will call you on Tuesday." I said, "I will be here." He said, "I love you, Mom." I said, "I love you, Cyrus." He walked into the trees with Wendell. The forest closed behind him. The naming ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in early October of 2026. A year and a half after I had first walked into this forest, the sky was high and cold and blue. The kind of Appalachian morning that makes everything look etched in glass. Dr. Adelina Brockwell came with 4 faculty members, 2 administrators, and a small brass plaque produced by the university's facilities department. The plaque read, "Castagna Pembertoni, a new cultivar of the American chestnut, Castanea dentata, identified on this site by Harlan A. Pemberton, United States Forest Service, in 2006, named in honor of Harlan and Eleonora Pemberton, stewards of this forest." We gathered at the base of the largest chestnut, the one Harlan had documented first, the one that had no right to exist, but existed anyway, standing 40 feet tall, with bark the color of old silver. Adelina spoke briefly. She said the tree represented something science did not have an adequate word for, which was the stubbornness of life in the face of every reason to die. She said Harlan Pemberton had found it and protected it and kept it secret for 15 years. She said I had continued that protection and made it permanent. She said the tree now bore our name because our name belonged on it. Roderick was there with his 2 children, 12 and 10, brought home from Ray's for the weekend. They were learning to come to the forest. Cyrus was there with his 2 children, 14 and 11. They had come for the first time in April, for spring break. Just as Cyrus had promised, they had been shy at first. By the end of the week, they had found the creek. They had named all the chickens. They had decided, with the firm certainty of children, that this place was theirs. They had come back 3 times since. Tessa had come for the first time in August, 2 months after the divorce finalized. She had come alone. She had sat on the porch. She had cried. She had said, "Nora, I think I owe you an apology." I had said, "We will see." She had said, "Fair." She had come back twice since. I am not sure what she is to me yet, but she is something, and something, after 10 years of being nothing, is a beginning. I stood beside the chestnut. I put one hand on the bark. It was rough and cool, under my palm, ridged with age, alive with the slow internal work of a living thing. I looked at the plaque, Castanea Pembertoni. Both of us, that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on the porch in the rocking chair, with one of Harlan's field notebooks open on my lap, the one from 2014, saved from the stormwater. The entry I had marked with a slip of yellow paper years ago. The resurrection fern greened up again. Every October it greens up, 20 years now. What constancy, what fidelity. There are things that need no reason other than to continue. I closed the notebook. I looked at the forest. The white oaks were holding their leaves, bronze and copper. In the October light, the 2 chestnuts Roderick and Cyrus had planted at the edge of the clearing were growing side by side. Roderick's was taller by a foot. Cyrus's was catching up. The serviceberry orchard was bare, but alive. The branches holding the buds that would open in April. The creek was running, lower than summer. The resurrection fern on the east window was green. It had rained 2 days ago. A gentle October rain. I sat in the rocking chair. 74 years old now. I did not smile because I had won anything. I smiled because I had arrived. And so, I want to say this to you, whoever you are, listening tonight. If you are a woman of a certain age who has felt invisible, if you are a mother whose children have stopped calling, if you are a wife whose husband has died and left you in a room you do not recognize, if you are standing on a sidewalk somewhere with a suitcase and no idea where to go next, listen to me. You are not finished. Your story is not over. There is something waiting for you. I do not know what it is. I do not know where it is. I do not know who placed it there or how long ago, but it is there. It might be in a letter you have not opened. It might be in a forest no one has told you about. It might be in a phone call from a son you have not heard from in years. It might be in a friendship with a woman you have not met yet. It might be in your own hands, in the things they can still do, the basil they can still plant, the bread they can still bake, the grandchildren they can still hold. It is there. You just have to be willing to walk through the door. I am Eleanor Pemberton. I am 74 years old. I live in a house my husband built for me, in a forest my sons once called worthless. And the resurrection fern on my east window is green because it rained 2 days ago. If this story reached something inside you tonight, if it reminded you that the most valuable things are almost never the loudest, that love does not disappear when someone dies, it just waits for the right moment to be opened, that you are never too old to be found. Stay with me a moment longer. Take a breath, look around the room you are in, and ask yourself, what is the door I have not walked through yet? What is waiting for me? Because I promise you, something is waiting, the way the resurrection fern waits for rain